Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary and Sebastian.
And we're joined today by a guest in the studio, which I always like. We're joined by Adam Williams, who is the SDP's new Campaigns Organiser.
Hello, yes.
Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Well, there's not too much to talk about that at the moment, seeing as I started yesterday. So
what we're going to do today, rather than an interview, rather than a Bring Me Solutions, we're going to do a news item each, aren't we?
That's right, yes.
So I'm going to talk about, and I apologise for this in advance, I'm going to talk about Boris Johnson.
Okay.
I know we'd all like to forget about Boris Johnson, but I think there's an interesting element to that story that's cropped up about him potentially coming back, which the media love to go on about.
Okay.
You're going to talk about...
the gender pay gap, so I'm going to go on mathsy again, I'm afraid.
Okay, no, good. I like that. Never apologise for maths.
yes.
And you're going to talk about...
I'm going to talk about the latest round of education cuts to healthcare and medical courses at universities that Phillipson kind of did under the radar.
Okay,
so,
excellent. Well, why... I don't know, we haven't decided on an order. You've got an order.
Well, I was going to say, before we start, shall we mention loyal listener Tom?
Well, yeah, we can do. Tom.
Yeah, who emailed in, didn't he, to point out that he disagreed with your thinking that the calculator was wrong.
Yeah, so, and this is, I think, I mentioned this in perhaps last week's podcast or the one before, that minus 10 squared should be 100, because minus 10 times minus 10. But on the calculator it said minus 100. And some calculators will say minus 100, some will say plus 100. And what it is some calculators will be listening to the rules of BODMAS.
Oh, Tom called it BIDMAS.
BIDMAS, yeah, brackets, indices, division, multiplication.
That's taking me back a bit, that is.
Yeah, right. I personally think if you're writing minus 10 squared, you're clearly meaning minus 10 times minus 10.
But he said to get the right answer, you would put minus 10 in brackets and then squared.
And for anybody for a handy tip for all of our listeners that are doing many multiplication sums on their calculators, what you can always do is you can always use brackets to tell it which bit you want it to do first.
Correct. Yes. So thanks, Tom.
There you go.
So running order.
Yes. Okay. Go on.
I've got a suggestion.
Yes. Go
just
for it.
Just because mine's probably going to be the lightest, so I thought maybe do mine in the middle.
Okay.
Do yours first, mine, and then yours, Adam?
Yeah, sure, sounds good to me. Yeah,
okay, so why is the gender pay gap in the news, or why have you been thinking about it?
So it's in the news because there are new requirements in the Employment Rights Bill. It's not an act yet, is it? The Employment Rights Bill, which we talked about before a little bit, haven't we?
Yeah.
But there are new requirements in that around employers, requiring employers to have an action plan to address their gender pay gaps. Now, one of the things that Baroness Claire Fox, friend of the show,
she's been on,
had mentioned in the House of Lords was that the what's on the face of the bill is nothing about what should be in these action plans, or whether there are any specific requirements, whether there are any penalties for employers who don't do them. So it's very much kind of an enabling act, which, as she said to us when she was on the podcast, that's one of the problems that. The problem is that if you leave all these things till later on, you can't really scrutinise a bill because you don't know what the requirements are going to be. So that's why it's in the news. But I thought it wasn't a bad idea just to remind people what it is and some of the limitations of it. So do we know what gender pay gap is?
Does gender exist?
Well, that's a whole other can of worms.
That is a slight issue because two things: the gender that's used in gender pay gap statistics is not defined. So presumably, if somebody chose to identify as a gender, they could do that for gender pay gap stats. But there is actually a wider issue that there is no reliable data source for a person's sex at birth.
Oh.
So anybody who has a gender GRC, what was it called? What was that?
Gender
recognition certificate. Yes, that's right. They can change their birth certificate.
Okay.
Somebody can change their passport anyway, even without a GRC. Oh. So actually, there is no reliable source for somebody's sex.
I'm worried that I'm derailing the conversation a little bit here, but if you have a medical issue and the doctor requires to know it's up to the patient themselves then to say, oh, by the way, I was born a man or a woman.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, that's bit by the by.
By the by,
Yes.
yeah. Let's talk about the gender pay gap.
So it's not maths at all, that, is it?
No.
So gender pay gap. So any employer who has more than 250 employees has to provide disclosures in their accounts on the gender pay gap numbers. So there's quite a lot of different stats, but perhaps just to focus on two. One is the pay gap between men's median earnings and women's median earnings. And the other is the gap between men's average or mean earnings and women's mean earnings.
And can we just explain the difference there?
Yes, I was going to test you actually.
Okay.
So what's the mean average?
Mean is when you add up all of the data points, then divide it by the number of data points that there are.
Yeah, and median
is if you put them in order. So you took all of the men from the lowest earning to the highest earning, and you took the middle man, and he will be the median average.
Thank you for reminding me of GCSE maths.
Yes,
Long gone.
So at the moment, the mean or average pay gap is around about 13%. The median is around about 7%.
Right.
So why is one much less than the other?
Because of skew?
Yes, yeah. So averages or means can be a bit misleading if you've got one very high outlier or a few very low outliers.
Just to give an example on that, I think one of the best examples of the difference between median and mean could be something like house prices, because a house, there is going to be a minimum price to a house, right, which might be around £100,000, but there is no real maximum. So you could have houses that are 80, 90 million. So whilst the median might be here, those really, really high values push the mean up further than the median.
Yeah. And it's the same with pay, actually, because there is a minimum to pay, which is minimum wage, So that gap has been, in both of those statistics, the gap's been narrowing since these statistics were first published around about 1997. And in fact, for younger people, there is either almost no pay gap, or there's what people call a negative pay gap, which means that the women's pay is higher than the men's pay.
Sounds like a bad thing, doesn't it? A negative pay gap.
It sounds like a bad thing, but, it is for men, I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I guess one of the issues for this action plan that's in the Employment Rights Bill is if you've got a negative pay gap, should your action plan say, this is what we're doing to address the fact that men aren't making as much progress in the workplace as women? I think that'd be a reasonable thing to do, to be honest.
So.
Yeah.
I'd say so.
So the thing that I think people get very confused about in gender pay gaps is that they imagine it means that women are paid less than men, generally. And it's really important to say that that's not what gender pay gaps show. So we have a law that says you cannot pay a man and a woman different amounts of work for the same work, for the same job.
Different amounts of pay for the same job.
Different amounts of pay for the same job, Even actually, it's actually a bit wider than that, because it says you can't pay them different amounts for work of equal value, which is something we've talked about before.
The equal value work,
Yeah, so let's not go down that rabbit hole.
That's
So what gender pay gaps don't show is that women are being paid less than men for the same job. Because what gender pay gaps look at is just what everybody is paid. They don't make any allowance for different occupations, different levels of experience, different ages, different times amounts of time that you've been doing that specific job. They don't take account of any of those things. So the fact that they are different is not an indication that people are being paid different amounts for the same job. It does, I think we should be really clear that it does say, what it does tell you is that on average, this is very much on average, women do end up doing jobs that are paid less. And that's in part because they do different jobs. In parts it's because they make choices about the levels of responsibility they're comfortable with, given that lots of women have childcare responsibilities for older generation, perhaps often have lots of other community work that they do. And so, I think one of the things that's problematic is that women are often made to feel guilty, kind of letting the side down for deciding not to take on extra responsibility. And, you know, I'm a firm believer that men and women are equal but different. They're not the same. And it's entirely reasonable that they make different choices, especially after childbirth. And I think it's also, you know, to defend employers a bit, I think it's entirely reasonable that if a woman has, you know, 5 years out, say, for a family, when she comes back, she's got 5 years less experience in that job. And of course, she's not going to go back straight into a job that's on equal par with a man or a woman who's stayed in the workplace for that 5 years. So it's really important, I think, that we're clear that what gender pay gaps don't mean is that women are paid less, but they do mean that women do jobs that are paid less. Now, I don't want to let employers off the hook. You know, I'm a great advocate for women's rights in the workplace, and I think it is still the case that there are things in the workplace that do discriminate against women. So, for example, lots of employers don't promote people who don't ask for promotion. And typically men ask for promotion and women don't. And so, you know, quite often women will end up not making as much progress as men, even if, you know, there's no issue around them having spent time outside of the workplace. And I think it is important that some of those issues are addressed in workplaces, but I'm absolutely sure that this stuff in the Employment Rights Bill won't make any difference to those kind of problems in the workplace. And in fact, what I do think that with a lot of these issues, these kind of bureaucratic requirements on workplaces, is that they do make us less efficient because employees have to spend time doing all these things, and we don't know what else they're going to have to do as a result of the new requirements. There's actually an extra clause in the bill, clause 32, that says employers also have to look at gender pay gaps in their suppliers to see if they can address those. What? Which, you know, again, I just think employers should just concentrate on making widgets, really, and doing that in the most efficient way.
That's our
they
message
can.
to employers: just make widgets.
Make widgets.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's kind of crazy that you have to look at your suppliers and go, hey, what's going on?
Exactly.
Like, I feel like that's not your responsibility.
Absolutely. And of course, we'd all like to have suppliers who treat their workers fairly, and certainly that's something we've been thinking of, isn't it, in terms of some of the suppliers for the party. But I think, you know, requiring them to undertake kind of audits of their suppliers, gender pay gaps, is going a bit far, really. So I think there's all kinds of problems with this. The other problem, I think, is always that, again, this is something we've talked about before, that there's a real problem for growing businesses, that when they get to like 230, 240, they kind of think, well, once I'm beyond 250, I've got to do all this extra stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a restraint on growth. And you know, that's, again, a problem if we really want to see British industry growing. I
agree.
Good.
With all of it. I don't really have much counter. I would add, though, that something you brought up before is that these oversimplistic statistical analysis, like just taking all of the workforce and saying, right, we'll add up all of their wages and divide it by the number that there are, and we'll get a mean wage. And then we say, oh, women seem to be earning less, so we need to institute these policies. It can have some harmful consequences, like if you're an employer and you're employed 200 people and there's a gap, you're incentivized to start employing men on the lower end of the pay scale.
Yeah.
Which is not what anybody wants.
Absolutely.
You know, as a consequence, pure consequence from this.
Exactly. Absolutely.
These sort of acts worry me a bit because we've seen it with the Equalities Act in Birmingham.
Equality Act
in Birmingham. My apologies. And how they've been manipulated for ideological purposes.
Yeah.
And it worries me that you get these vague sort of wishy-washy, like, filled bills like this, and I worry that potentially you could see another situation where it gets taken out of context by a judge who's an activist for something and goes, hey, this company's doing this, even though logically they're doing nothing wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it is ideological purposes. I think, you know, if you're a trade union rep and you're trying to get your workers more pay, using some of these daft laws to do that, I don't think it's unreasonable. And I don't think they're being ideological. They're just trying to get their workers more pay.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a bad thing for trade unions to be doing. So, you know, I do think you've got to look for the problems in terms of the faulty legislation rather than the way that that's perhaps being used in a kind of manipulative way to get better terms and conditions for workers.
Yeah, I'll just add it to the list of another thing that we have to deal with.
Address. Yeah. So I think that's probably all I want to say. I thought it was worth talking about it as it's in the news and just having a bit of a wider discussion to say that, you know, unequal pay is still illegal and gender pay gaps don't prove that that's what employers are doing.
Yeah, and I think a lovely takeaway from that is, I think, in line with the way that we want to think as a political party and the sort of improvements we can make to public discourse. You said, rather than saying you're looking at this gender pay gap and saying, why are women getting paid less than men? Your question is, why is it that women are seemingly choosing to do jobs or doing jobs that are paid less than men? And that's a much more interesting question and can lead us to some better solutions.
Some women.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is all average.
For all average. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I seem to hear that you want to talk about Boris Johnson from the fact that you're wrapping up. You're keen to
I'm keen to move
Boris.
on. Yeah.
So this is a couple of articles float around, and this will happen every couple of months. Articles float around with maybe Boris should make a comeback, right?
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson, of course, was Prime Minister from 2019 to 2022. He had a lot of scandals at that time, and he was ousted, and Liz Truss replaced him as leader, and then they've since had Rishi Sunak, and I think after Sunak, it's Kemi Badenoch. But I'm sure I'm going to miss one at some point because there's so many of them. So Kemi Badenoch is doing very badly, by all accounts, as Conservative leader. She's doing very badly in the polls and the favourability rankings. And a lot of people in the Conservative Party, supposedly, according to the news, are very unhappy with her leadership, and there's talk of her being replaced at some point. I think if we look at it, it does make sense that she's not going to make it to the next election. I think a lot of people would assume that. I don't know, do you disagree?
So I've obviously got a bit of background with the Conservative Party.
Which is?
Which is, I was a member from 2017 to 2022.
Until you were healed.
Until I was healed. Or until I figured out how to actually cancel my membership. Because they don't make it easy. And so I was around for a lot of the original Boris hype and the Truss-Sunak debacle, which is when I left after that little thing happened. And I remember when Boris got elected and everyone was so happy.
Yeah.
Because his leadership election, I think, was July. And then I went to the conference here in Manchester in October, September time, and everyone was hyped. There was this I'm looking back at it, it was so cringe.
And he replaced Theresa May, didn't he?
Yes.
He did.
He did, yes.
Because, of course, famously, when Theresa May got elected, he ruled himself out, despite being the person that was in prime position after the Brexit referendum.
Yes, because he wanted to let someone else take the fall for it.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
But Kemi, so the way the membership works, the membership elected Kemi, and I think until the membership decides that there's a difference between, and this is the issue of the Conservative Party, is there is somewhat widening gap between their MPs and their membership.
Yeah.
And a lot of the MPs favoured Jenrick or one of the other candidates, but the membership decided on Kemi. And until the membership changes its mind about her, which may happen, but I think that she may stick around for a bit longer, just because so much of the news is focused on Labour and no one is openly making a play against her within, Jenrick's doing a lot, but he's not, as of yet, actually openly defied her. So I think she'll stick around for a bit longer than we think. Whether she makes it to 2029 is a different question, but I think she may last a couple of years. But of course, politics changes like that these days, isn't it? So I could be wrong, and tomorrow she could be gone.
I think Jenrick is definitely doing things to position himself to be in prime position to take over as Tory leader. And I think a lot of people would say he's the real leader of the opposition at the moment because he's actually holding the government to account on certain things. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think he's doing a far better job in that position than Kemi Badenoch.
He's kind of holding society to account, isn't he, with his fare dodging campaign as well?
I don't know if you saw this.
I did.
Yeah, so he... I
like that video.
For anybody that hasn't seen it, it's Robert Jenrick accosting people that have dodged their fares so that people that are slipping through the barriers on the London Tube, he goes up to them and says, "Excuse me, why haven't you paid?" And I think he does it in a way that's polite, and I think it's good because something we've talked about, and Hilary would be massively on board with this.
Yes, I
is
am.
holding people to account, and I think you do need some of that in our society to say we should be a cohesive society, right? Your actions influence me and influence the people around you. So I'm fully on board with that, and I think it's that sort of thing that he's astute because he's doing things that are he's showing what he means through his actions rather than just spouting.
So it's interesting. I know we've gone off from Boris a little bit.
We'll come back, don't worry.
Yeah, Generic, it's quite interesting because obviously he was in government for 14 years and he's in the process, and you can see it happening, he's in the process of converting from an establishment Conservative, so a Liberal, to...
That's a bad thing.
He's in the process of converting from that...
From a Liberal to something a bit more in tune with the actual Conservative heritage.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, that's what I mean by that.
Right, okay.
And that's why, so like his track record is a bit, but you can see it in the way that he's changing, that he's going from this sort of one nation Toryism that the party kind of kicked around for a while, which is just liberalism, to something a bit more actually Tory, of like the older school of thought, the older one nation. You're talking like, like Macmillan, that sort of Toryism.
Well, I think he understands a little bit of the sentiment out there in the public.
Yeah, because
so he knows where people are at, and he's trying to account for that.
Yeah, because they're crying out for an actual like Conservative sort of figure. Some people, yes, and the choices for them really are Reform, who again aren't actually a Conservative party, or the Tories, and I think that he's leading that sort of 1921 committee sort of style, the more red Tory-esque of the party. I think he's leaning more towards that.
Sure, it's a 22 committee, isn't it?
22. It's
I
22
thought 21 wasn't right.
No, it's not 21. No, it's 22. Sorry.
To bring it back to Boris Johnson, as I'm keen to do.
We all are.
Yes, back to Boris.
I think this is a fantastic example of the media being out of touch with the public.
Yeah.
So the media constantly say, I mean, look at Kemi Badenoch. She's not going to be able to win an election against Keir Starmer. And of course, the media can't get out of this idea that it has to be Labour or the Conservatives. They're still stuck in that. Those are the only two parties that could govern the country. And therefore, who could possibly win the election for the Conservatives? Well, if we go back, who was the last person to win an election for the Conservatives? Oh, it was Boris Johnson. So he must be, the public's choice. What I don't think they realise is how far the public have moved on from Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
How many people were voting for that Conservative Party at that time to get a specific result, which was Brexit.
Brexit done. Yeah.
And how many people now would say, no, you're not right to run the country at all. And what I would say is, well, before I say this, let me just go through some favourability rankings.
Okay.
So the media think, well, who else? It must be Boris then if we can't have Starmer or Badenoch or, Farage. Unfavourability for Starmer is at 69% and his favourability is at 23%, so it's negative.
That has dropped
a lot. A lot more people dislike him than like him. I don't think we'd be surprised by that.
No.
Farage is at 59-32. So really not too dissimilar. He's a little bit more popular than Starmer, but more people dislike him than like him.
59 is don't like.
59 is unfavourable.
Okay.
Yeah. People see him, unfavourably, and 32% see him favourably. If you're wondering why they don't add up to 100, it's because people that don't know the person or that don't know enough to comment. And you'll see that when it gets to Ed Davey. So Kemi Badenoch is at 55-16. So fewer people see her unfavourably, but fewer even still see her favourably, which is almost worse because it's like the other people, do they not know who she is? Because she's not putting herself out there enough. And Ed Davey even more still. Only 34% see him unfavourably, and 26% of people see him favourably. So when Johnson left office, so this was mid-2022, he was seen unfavourably by 68% of people and favourably by 25%. Right, so even when he was in office as Prime Minister, he wasn't particularly popular. after, a couple of years after that general election. So what I want to say to the media, and I want to say this to people watching, is we can do better. We can do better than these leaders that have got us into this mess in the first place. And we can be a little bit more adventurous and ambitious than just dredging up these names from the past that really don't care about the country. And I think we've got evidence to show that.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I think Boris is obsessed with his legacy. You see, because you see him doing a few more press releases these days, and I think he will go down in history as one of our worst prime ministers. And I think he is terrified about that because, there's the character, he's very flamboyant. He's very boisterous. He's like, and he did cultivate that sort of lovable idiot for a while, and that's completely collapsed now. And he's going to go down, and I think he's very aware of that because he's all about, he's done all the classics and stuff, and he talks about history a lot. And I think he's very aware of the fact that history judges you, and he's going to be judged very unfavourably. So I think he's trying to swing things to maybe I can make a comeback to make things a bit better and then fix my legacy. But I think he's too far gone.
Yeah, I agree.
So just a couple of extra comments before we move on. I think it's worth noting that often when you see an article about, Boris Johnson could be making a comeback, I think this is the media, and particularly the Telegraph are the ones that are really pushing this. Yeah. I think it's them trying to establish a narrative and also flying the flag. You know this expression?
Yeah.
Fly the flag, and do you know that?
Fly a kite, I would say.
Flying the kite.
Yeah.
Flying the kite, yeah, you might be right. Flying the kite, so you kind of test the water, you fly it and see, is there wind that can keep this the kite aloft?
Yeah. And
that's what they're saying with this, is what's the reaction to Boris? And he might even be part of that, because he was obviously worked for the Telegraph for many years. I don't know if he still does. I think he might still write for them. So that's one thing to note. The other thing then is that in order for him to come back, he would have to be a member of Parliament, of course.
Yes. Which he's not. And
of course, Kemi Badenoch would have to be okay with him standing as a candidate if there was a by-election or even at the next general election. So a lot would need to happen.
Yes.
But to be honest, I don't really care. And then I might just be compounding the noise around Boris Johnson by bringing him up on the podcast. So if I'm doing that, then I apologise.
Can he be Prime Minister from the House of Lords?
Can indeed.
You
yes.
can, yeah.
Another way then.
Yeah. But you'd have to be made, put into the House of Lords, which honestly wouldn't surprise me at this point.
No.
So you look at some of the names in there, you see Lord such and such pops up, Lord Hannon or Gove, or is Gove in the House of Lords?
He is now, yeah. He just
all these names popping up. I think they're literally there's no meritocracy when it comes to politics, is there?
No.
You can do it awfully, and you just get jobs for life.
The House of Lords has just ended into a retirement home for failed politicians.
Correct.
And it's quite sad.
Yeah.
Gosh, we're being really negative, aren't we?
We are.
Yes. We need to do better.
I'm going to be even more negative.
No. What this is it's a call for better politicians, which requires anybody listening to this to maybe question it and think, okay, maybe I could go into politics. I mean, that's what we've done.
That's what we've done,
joining the SDP. I didn't ever envisage this, but you join a party like the SDP that actually reflects the idea that we need more talent in our politics.
And I agree. I'd say to anybody who's still sort of semi-wedded to any of the older parties, like the Tories or Labour, but you're tired of the same old platitudes, you need to start looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
Because it's like the whole blue Labour conversation. They're like, we'll change the party from the inside. It's just not going to happen.
Agreed.
And it's time we look elsewhere. And I think the next 4 years, may show that. So.
We're running the risk of sounding like a shopping channel at the moment,
we
aren't
are.
we? We provide this lovely SDP.
Please add the SDP to your basket.
Right, okay. Healthcare,
degrees,
grants,
etc. Yeah.
Tell
us what's in the news.
This happened, the Telegraph broke the news a couple of days ago. Nursing Times have now also released an article as well. And there's two things to this that I want to talk about. So number one, the government has stealthily decided to freeze grants to universities for medical courses. So that's not just nurses, that's also allied healthcare professions. So we're talking physios and occupational therapists.
Radiographers?
Radiographers and others. So they've all had their funding frozen, which effectively is a cut because the universities were already struggling to make those teaching costs ends meet. So so they've completely shot down their whole proposal, which was to end reliance on foreign medical professionals in their manifesto and train up British workers. So that's put that down in the grave. So now we're going to have to rely on importing even more medical staff because we're just not training our own. And already, I think the latest figures was it's between 18 and 20% of the NHS is foreign staff. And that's just going to keep increasing. And there's two things to this. It's not a long-term solution. It's another short-termism, but we've come to expect that from Labour and the Conservatives. And it's also morally indefensible, I believe, and I know William's talked about this before, to strip developing nations of their own healthcare workers and leave them in the dirt and bring their healthcare workers here. When we have the resources to train our own, but instead we're basically pillaging Nigerian nurses when Nigeria needs the nurses. And I just don't think that's acceptable.
So the other way in which healthcare workers could be trained outside of the universities is through an apprenticeship scheme, isn't it? Is that not a better solution?
Well, they've also cut those as well.
Okay.
So they've cut a bunch of higher apprenticeship places.
Okay.
And I mean, I know, and I think the party believe, the official party policy is we bring back nursing apprenticeships.
Yes, absolutely.
And because I think Blair got rid of them originally.
Right, okay.
And that made it nursing needs a degree, which obviously adds another 3-4 years to the whole training cycle. And it's just makes it so much more difficult to actually train up your own medical staff. Because one of the complaints that obviously the government is like, oh, it's too expensive to train our own staff. And I'm like, well, if we made them apprentices again.
It's too expensive not to.
It is.
But it's too expensive in the long term to not to.
Exactly.
But it's too expensive in the short term to do it.
Yeah.
So, and they just choose the easy way out. The other thing they've done is they've also decided to cut agency spending, which, you know, you can make arguments that saying, oh, agency spending is inefficient and they're just there to make a bit of profit. But it's also another aspect for maybe nurses who are either trying to break into the industry to do a bit of 0-hour contract work, or for nurses who are maybe semi-retired but still want to keep on top of things and still want to get some experience. And they can go into the hospitals and with the agencies. And now the government's like, we are going to get rid of this. We are going to cut spending by $1 billion and all of this. And the agencies are obviously not happy. But it's another block because a lot of agency staff, they said they did a poll, this is in the Nursing Times, and they said a lot of their staff would not want to become part of like a staff pool or take on like a contractual work with a hospital or something like that. So you'd see a lot of people leaving the profession, like a lot of agency workers would leave the profession. So we've got them cutting training, and we've got them cutting funding to agencies, which it's just another thing where they've kind of looked at something and gone, you know what, we just can't be bothered, and they've decided to take the easy road out, and they go for this sort of, and it's the classic thing of, it's easier for us to take healthcare staff that are already trained, but not necessarily to British standards. There is also that issue as well, and bringing them in and just stick them in a British hospital rather than training up our own homegrown. And you can bring this in, and this is not just nursing, it's occupational therapists as well, as I've said, but also then you can bring in the conversation about how the medical, like for doctors, the places are limited every year. So we artificially limit our medical staff's growth.
Yeah, just to expand on that, it's something like 9,500.
Yeah, 9,500. Yeah, something.
And the NHS recognises that not only do they need 8,000 something, but that there is an attrition rate of about a third. So the NHS themselves recognise that we're not training up enough because of this cap, this artificial cap,
which is it's just arbitrary, and it's just there for no reason. I think it's the whole point of it is to save costs again, which is another short-termism. But then you would take into consideration that a lot of then newly trained doctors or medics then look at Australia, and they go to Australia. Like a lot of British trained medical staff just go to Australia because they're paid better and they're treated better. So there's an onion to this, but this is just another layer.
How many nurses do we train a year? Do we know?
Oh, I don't know that.
Number that is.
I
It
don't
must
know
be
that off the
quite.
top.
It must be a big number. That must. If it's 9,500 doctors, it must be
More.
50,000.
Don't guess.
I don't know.
No, I'm not going to guess. No, I say I don't have that number on the top of my head, so I couldn't comment. But it would be a safe assumption to say that we would train. You'd believe, in theory, we would train more nurses than we would doctors.
Certainly,
it makes more logical sense.
There's more nurses in the NHS. Than
Exactly.
doctors,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, so I think we're basically saying that the government should be funding these these, I was going to say courses, but what we would do is apprenticeships, especially for nurses.
100%. Yeah.
You shouldn't necessarily be going to university, right? It's, again, you mentioned Tony Blair. It was the whole idea of we need everybody going to university.
Everyone goes to
right?
uni, yeah.
And that's something that I think in the SDP we realise is no, it's not necessary. And I think a lot of people out there, I mean, I didn't go to university, a lot of people out there realise that you don't actually need to go to university. Just on this, is this something that Labour have announced, or is this just leaked?
They were very quiet about it.
Because I've not heard anything about it, and you said you read it in the Nursing Times.
So originally, the original article was the Telegraph. The YSD, we found it and we put out a press release because for young people, again, it's another barrier for us.
Yeah.
For any young Brits out there who want to be a nurse, good luck.
Just explain what the YSD
Sorry,
is.
yes, the Young Social Democrats, so everyone under the age of 30 is in the party, is a Young Social Democrat, and I'm also Young Social Democrat chair, as well as Campaigns Organiser. So this is with my YSD hat on. And so we found it. We found the Telegraph article on X, and I read it, and I was like, okay. So, but the Conservatives have commented on it. The Shadow is Laura Trott, I believe. She's the Shadow. She's commented, she's put out a press statement about it. And I thought, right, well, we'll run on this because this is another example of Labour choosing to not invest in the future of this country. And so we found it on the Telegraph, and then the Nursing Times have put it out. The agency thing I found through the Nursing Times as well. I didn't find that anywhere else. That's something that slipped under the radar, and I think we should look into as well, because I feel like that is Labour trying to scapegoat the agency staff and groups. And so there's a quote. There's a quote in from one of the agency guys. He says that this is a sledgehammer trying to crack a walnut.
Right.
About what Labour's doing to the agencies.
Yeah.
And there's another one who asks that Labour really shouldn't be treating us as like a periphery thing as part of the problem, but they should be working in partnership with us for a long-term plan for the NHS.
Yeah.
And I would agree with that. I think actually if you want to, agency conversation is a whole other topic. But if you want to end reliance on agency staff, there should be a better way to merge them into the pre-existing structure of the healthcare service.
Yeah.
Rather than just smashing them in the face and going, we don't want you anymore.
Yeah.
And I think again, it speaks to the lack of interest in innovating ideas from this government, where they're like, oh, we could be creative about this. We could have solutions that are interesting and new, or we could just do the easy thing, which is be like, nah, can't be bothered.
I guess what's a bit disappointing about this is that it's only 2 years ago since NHS England launched their first long-term NHS workforce planning report, which was all about the need to invest in workers for the longer term.
Yeah.
And I know NHS England has gone now, but it did feel that was a real step forward, that they were actually thinking longer term, and for them to kind of rip all that up now feels a bit disappointing, really.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where they say, like, they'll say things and they'll be like, everyone with common sense and logic will look at it and go, yes, we need a long-term plan.
Yeah.
But then they'll just do the opposite. And that's what and I've kind of gotten accustomed to that, of they'll be like, oh, well, we need a long-term plan, but actually we're not going to bother.
So why are they then? What, I know you're kind of suggesting motives, but what's the actual current day stimulus that has made them make this decision? Is it just cash?
That's what they say.
Okay.
You know, and they've said like, oh, we need to cut it because Phillips and Needs and Reeves are apparently set to have a bit of a bust up, because like the school's budget's ring fenced, so they can't cut that, so they have to make cuts somewhere else. And they've been cutting like the artsy programs, you know, like the like media studies and other various things that are deemed not as necessary. From the universities, because the university system, and this is a wider conversation, right, is that the university system is artificially propped up by the way it's all, you know, it's a bit of a Ponzi scheme now. Where,
well, I never like people using that word Ponzi scheme. I don't think people really understand what that means.
I think, maybe using it in a bit blasé, but it's sort of it speaks to the wider issue in the fact that the universities are artificially propped up by the student loans and people being railroaded into the university system. And so, but now they're like, well, we have to cut spending because they can't afford to, and they keep talking about the £22 billion black hole.
Yeah,
because you said it the other day, Starmer, and it's part of that. and it's part of like, they're like, oh, we need to make cuts. So they're looking at it. But I would argue that making cuts to medical training is probably one of the places you shouldn't be making cuts to.
Absolutely.
And maybe we should not be giving Mauritius money if we need to make cuts. So, it's just things like that. And
you're bringing in lots of different things here that people might not be.
But yeah, sorry, that's the Chagos Island things where we're paying, for those who don't know, where we're paying Mauritius to lease our own territory by giving it back to them and paying them for the privilege of keeping Diego Garcia there. So we're paying them to do that, and not it's like 10 billion over a course of years. And so they're making decisions like that, but at the same time being like, oh yeah, we're going to cut costs for our medical training, and it's like, it just doesn't make sense.
I agree.
So it's really hard, and I really struggle with this because it's really difficult to figure out what's the motive.
Yes.
Because it doesn't make any logical sense, and it's politically a really stupid move because it gives any opposition party, like the Tories or the Lib Dems, if they said anything about it, ammunition to use against the Labour government, being like, well, you're sabotaging our healthcare.
You'd have thought the trade unions would be a bit upset about it as well.
Well, you
presumably
would.
the RCN have said something, the Royal College of Nursing.
They have, but most of the RCN news at the moment is that the nurses are going to go on strike about this pay rise thing as well. So there's also that going on.
Of course.
So they've kind of slipped it under the radar, this whole thing. But the RCN have said this is bad, to paraphrase.
Good.
But you'd think they'd be a bit more stronger about it.
Yeah.
But I think they're a bit preoccupied with the pay thing at the moment.
Okay.
So
a plea for longer term planning in the health service, I think, is what
very
we're
much so.
suggesting.
And for Boris Johnson to stay in retirement.
I would like Boris Johnson to stay in retirement, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
And for people to speak with more sense about things like the gender pay gap rather than reducing things to simplicities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got some suggestions today.
We have.
I feel like we didn't really disagree with each other at all, did we?
No, we haven't.
Sort of each topic, we were like, yeah, we agree with that.
Yeah.
So if you disagree,
Yes,
get in
let
touch.
us know.
Let us know.
Yeah,
And
please do.
and we will respond to you just like we responded to Tom about the calculator question.
Yeah.
And we'll put all our email addresses in the show notes.
We will. And we will see you again next week.
Indeed. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having
Tom.
me.
Bye now.